The art of storytelling is incredibly important to me.
Any sort of art should be extravagant to break through everything else that feels so tame.
Giving order to the world around us and making sense of it through storytelling is the way that we connect to each other.
It's very easy to get rid of dynasties, you just don't vote for them.
The idea is to try and write from all perspectives.
Both sides should be asked to explain exactly what they mean.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Caitlin Reiger. I'm the CEO of the Human Rights Law Centre, and I am delighted to see another sold-out event here at the Wheeler Centre as part of our collaboration to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Human Rights Law Centre this year. 20 years of fearless action for human rights protections for all. Welcome also to those of you who are joining on the live stream. Before we start, I'd like to first acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders and for their custodianship and connection to these lands and waters. We also acknowledge, as we talk about what's happening out there in the world and the human rights issues that we are seeing, we acknowledge that their laws and protocols, of course, endure and were violently disregarded as colonisation began and continued in what we now call Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge also that the work of the Europe Justice Commission and the treaty process that is moving forward in Victoria is a small step towards addressing those injustices. Tonight we are all here to, I think, because we share, most likely, a concern about what we are seeing in our communities, in our workplaces, on our TV screens, on our phones, both around the world and also closer to home. We're seeing the growth of authoritarianism, anti-immigrant sentiment, ethno and religious nationalism, open resort to militarisation and conflict, winding back of reproductive rights, impunity for serious human rights violations, and attacks on the very core institutions and frameworks that have, even if imperfectly and unevenly, held together to some measure over the last 80 years and have made significant progress towards growing peace and progress towards greater equality and dignity for all. The spectre of masked white supremacist groups marching in the streets or threats of political violence is no longer something that feels far away. We are not immune from what is an increasingly well-resourced and very well strategised global movement that is now taking hold here. Those efforts are normalising what was once seen as fringe. Before we sat down tonight, we were reflecting that even when this event was booked, things have continued to progress in terms of the polling of a certain party that was once seen as fringe and suddenly has moved much more into the limelight with all of the resourcing that we know has amplified that. Only 2 weeks ago, ASIO Chief Mike Burgess warned that Australia's risk of political violence and extremism has risen, and the most significant threat is coming from homegrown radicalised men who identify with white supremacist ideologies. That political party even uses its name to claim to be a unifying force, but we know that what is actually being promoted is divisive and dangerous rhetoric. Tonight, we have an incredible panel to help us unpack these various trends and threads that we are seeing out there in the world and that really represent significant threats to the very concept of human rights. So we're going to unpack a little bit of what people are seeing, what it means for different communities, but more importantly, how we might also respond in ways that are grounded in the core values of equality, dignity and fairness for all. So our panel tonight is composed of an amazing array of thinkers, activists, writers, advocates in various forms. First of all, I'm going to start over with you, Oscar. Oscar Kaspi-Crutchett is a trade unionist and writer based in Melbourne. He's currently serving as the Senior Research Organiser at Victorian Trades Hall Council, the peak body of Victorian unions representing over 400,000 workers. His work has been focusing on key threats and opportunities for working class power in the 21st century, and also the far right, as well as other threats around artificial intelligence, democratic decay and economic inequality, none of which perhaps are actually that separate from each other. Oscar is also one of the key people behind an amazing publication that we will get to a little bit later that's called Antidote, and looking at what we can actually do to tackle some of these threats and how these things are wound and woven together. Next to Oscar, we have Tarneen Onus-Williams. Is a Yiga Gunditjmara Bindal Yorta Yorta person who has worked in Aboriginal community control most of their career. Tarneen is also working at the moment in the prison abolition movement as an outreach support worker for women on remand and bail, supporting them in prison and the community. We had the great privilege at the Human Rights Law Centre of representing Tarneen earlier this year in a landmark piece of litigation that overturned the Victorian Police's attempts to designate the entirety of the Central Business District as a stop and search zone with extraordinary powers, and we thank Tarneen for the incredible work there. Cam Wilson, next to me here, is an Australian investigative reporter who writes about the influence of technology on politics, business and culture. He has covered Australia's far right and politics fringes in award-winning investigations, and his book Conspiracy Nation, which is down the back of the room if anyone would like to get a copy at the end of the night. The subtitle is Inside the Hidden and Dangerous World of Australian Conspiracy, and hopefully we'll get a chance to unpick a little bit as well the sort of connections between some of the elements and strategies that feed conspiracies and the overlap with what we see in the far right. He's also the ABC's National Artificial Intelligence reporter, and prior to this has written for outlets including The Guardian, Nine Papers and Crikey. And last of all, but not least, my colleague Sanmati Verma is down the end. She is the Legal Director of the Migration Justice Team at the Human Rights Law Centre. She's also an advisor to the United Workers Union, co-chair of the Visa Cancellation Working Group, and serves on the board of the Migrant Workers Centre. Sanmati has written and published widely on race, policing and the political economy of migration. So we have about 50 minutes to dive into some of the things that we are seeing and what is going on. Just over a year ago, the federal electorate resoundingly rejected Trumpist politics, but how quickly things change. Since then, major public surveys by the Scanlon Foundation and McKinnon, for example, respectively showed significant decline in public trust in our institutions, our political leaders and democratic values even. The Australian Human Rights Commission has documented the rise of racism and the corresponding pain and distress experienced by Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim and Arab communities even just since the 7th of October 2023. We've had a terrorist attack in Bondi an explicit anti-Semitic attack. We've also had First Nations communities increasingly being targeted with threats of terrorism and violent attacks here in Melbourne on camp sovereignty, as well as threats in Boorloo, Perth. So to start off, I'm going to ask each of you to tell me a little bit about what are you seeing in the respective positions that you occupy, the communities that you work with. What's driving this and what are the real effects?
So thanks for having me here, first of all. So I am a journalist who's paying attention to this kind of stuff as it affects people in Australia, and my focus has been on technology for my journalistic career. And the reason that I was drawn to that is because, when I was starting in journalism, more than a decade ago, this was the middle of the 2010s. Tech was rising as a new power centre in society. It's kind of hard to remember. Like you look back and you kind of forget that for a long time, like tech was really seen as like the good guy. Like these were the people who were going to solve all the problems. Like, the next algorithm update was going to just really fix everything. But obviously, as we've seen over the last decade in particular, technology has often been used as a tool to spread hate, and I think that is not necessarily inherent to technology. I believe in technology has the ability to uplift us, bring people together, but it also can be used for wrong reasons, whether it's by intention or whether it's by dereliction of duty by the people who are in charge of it. For example, if they don't care about things like what happens on platforms and are just more concerned with the bottom line. Obviously, we've seen, the way that there was the Trump movement rose over the late 2010s and how it used technology in a very sophisticated way and bent the internet to work in its advantages in a lot of the way. And so since then, I've always just really been interested in paying attention to it, particularly as it comes to the far right and white supremacy, because, one thing that technology has done is it has removed gatekeepers. And I think that there are definitely good things about that. I think it has good impacts and bad impacts. I'm not going to come up here and say in defence of gatekeepers, the ones who kept certain things only available to certain people. But there was at least a little bit more in some cases of floodgates against some of this stuff. Whereas now with these platforms that allows anyone to reach anyone at an incredible scale, with rules that are based on not Australian expectations, what community members want, but based on rules of other, often one guy in the US who decides what goes, and then two, how well they're enforced, which is not very well. We've seen far-right white supremacists use this to great advantage to smuggle their ideas increasingly into the mainstream now that there's nothing really stopping them from going there. And to be honest, they've found in many cases a willing audience. They've found ways to use institutions to further this as well. So this is not merely the effect of the internet, but it has been such a massive unlock for them that's made all this possible. And that's kind of what you see every single day when you look into your feed. You just see those things that, you just I can't, sometimes it becomes feels like it's ordinary now, but you're like, I can't believe that that's, it's normal for me to see stuff like that. So that's what I see.
So I sent my bio in late, and I do not work as a social worker anymore, but I am a community organiser for Common Threads, and we are an organisation that work on treaty and climate justice, and one of the things that we've been doing is organising volunteers, for instance, and it's people are constantly looking at the internet, watching what people are saying, and this orange party, maybe a lady with orange hair, is just grabbing so many people's attention and sucking people in. And recently I hosted a volunteer catch-up for volunteers in the north, and we were getting volunteers to go out into farmers markets and hand out pamphlets and chat to people about treaty, for instance. And just everybody in that room that had gone to these farmers markets and spoke to people in real life just found it so fulfilling and was just oh wow, the world doesn't suck as much as I think, because I'm not looking into a screen and into like my phone that is telling me that like this person who has so much hate and is preaching so much violence towards communities of colour, First Nations people, trans people, doesn't have as much like weight as we think she does, because these big tech companies, and as we've seen with like different like reports from the Sydney Morning Herald and Channel 9 recently, with the way that she's hiring people. I don't know if anyone's seen that. I'm in deep, but I think that it just forces us to like keep looking at her content, for instance, and one of the things that people are more keen to do is chat to people in real life, and we're organising people to do door knocking in electorates over the next 6 months, because we need people to have conversations with each other. After what happened in the US with the election of Trump again, we know that it's like tearing families apart. People can't talk to each other. So what can we do? When we've seen this happen, like across the sea, what are the lessons to be learned? And we're trying to find out what are the lessons that we can learn from our friends in the US that keeps us together, and what is like our common ground. How do we keep our families together and not hand them over to the far right? And so that's some of the things I guess we're doing and that we've seen, and people are really keen to like keep their families and their friends together and not let them go over to the far right.
Yeah, I think these ideas around community and connection is something that I think we'll come back to. But Oscar, what are you seeing? Where's the Labor movement at in these times?
So I have the extraordinary privilege of working for the peak body for trade unions, and so that means that I am lucky enough to be able to speak to workers from a really, a total cross-section of society, workers in the care economy, workers on the docks, hospitality, retail, and that has informed a lot of our work that we put together on the far right. I think a good place to start is in conversations like this, we often talk a lot about trust in institutions. How do we rebuild trust in the system as it stands? How do we build trust in democracy? In my perspective, no system of government is entitled to the trust of the people that it rules over. Trust is you can kind of imagine trust as like a resource that can get spent and exhausted or can be earned. And what we hear from workers from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, is the last few decades have exhausted their trust. They're looking at futures for their children or their grandchildren that are not as prosperous as theirs were. They're looking at more intense workloads, housing affordability, and the impacts of these stresses are not equally distributed. They are much more concentrated in marginalised groups, but across the board, there is this pessimism, this gloominess. And what we want to see in the union movement is we want to see our democratic system that we value so much. We want to see it deliver for people in a way that it was able to do in the past, to ensure a baseline standard of living. I think when it comes to the far right, what we have sort of found in our experiences on the doors or, in focus groups is that the One Nation voter really is kind of comprised of this is a simplification, but it's one that I've found useful. There's really two camps of people here, and both of them require a really different response. The first is you have people who were radicalized, maybe as early as 2014, or with the Bendigo Mosque, or during COVID, or the vaccine rollout, or the Voice to Parliament. And these people are drawn to One Nation explicitly because of the ethnic nationalist, national identity, or the gender ideology panic sort of thing. These are the diehards. And those people, I think for volunteers, for progressives, and for all of us, those people are functionally gone. They're extremely difficult to engage with, and they're dangerous to engage with for a lot of our volunteers. But the good thing is they are a minority. There is a much larger, like a much thicker layer of the One Nation base that are people that are just fed up. They're looking for someone who will, who promises to have ambitions of major structural change. That's what they hear in Pauline Hanson, and that's why they're going there. And those people we can reach. I spend so much of my time at Trades Hall trying to confront, to find out how we can take this on. And after all that time, sincerely, I do have a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope in working people in Australia to see through this illusion. Pauline Hanson's not going to make anything better for them. She'll, not in their working life, not at all. And I just think in these discussions, it's worth keeping in mind, not only can we win, but I think in the long run we will.
All right, we're going to come back to some practical advice that I think is part of the antidote that's been described. But Sanmati, you work every day with people with insecure visa status who have been affected in many ways by what is a notoriously punitive immigration system in this country. What are you seeing? What's the real effects of what's going on out there?
Well, before I give you the very dire answer to that question, can I just say that I grew up in Bendigo with the functionally gone folks, and I don't buy that even those guys are not gettable. Yeah. I think those guys are gettable. I grew up with my dad working in the local paper, and I was in grade 6 when Pauline Hanson gave her maiden speech. And I just think, there was such a high union density in my dad's workplace, and, those guys struck all the time, and they were all, Pauline was in the background, and they'd just be like that. That was not, but I get that it was a different, class of folks who were mobilised at that time. It was sort of, small business owners, and now it's a different group of people who are being pushed towards Pauline. But anyway, let me answer your question. I think, that when we examine the sort of state of affairs that we're in, it's important to talk about change and our new terrain, and what confronts us, the fight that confronts us in real time now. But it's also important for us to focus on continuity and how we got to this place, so that we don't constantly come against our reality as a surprise, because in certain ways I don't think it is. And secondly, I think it's important to distinguish between sort of far-right populism and sort of far-right militancy, folks doing commando roles like outside of Ballarat and whatever, because I think that from where I stand, I wasn't born in this country, and like I said, I grew up in, Bendigo, soon after we attained permanency and then eventually citizenship. And I've got to say that far-right populists have been ghostwriting our immigration policy for 30 years. And in preparing for this speech, I had the, great occasion to reread Pauline Hanson's maiden speech and her, sort of salubrious initial treatise on immigration. And so what did she have to say at that time? So you've got to give it to her for consistency. So she sort of sets out this, map, and she fixes on stuff that's actually real. Like she's in Oxley, she's talking about, disinvestment in the regions. She's talking about secure jobs dissipating. She's talking about deindustrialisation in Queensland. She's talking about welfare gaps for families. She's a single mum. She's talking about stuff that people can see in front of them and that's real, like material stuff. But then she takes this sudden magical Steve Bannon-style pivot where she says that things that are material problems, expressions of material issues in the world, don't have a material source, but a cultural source. And that's the Aboriginal industry and multiculturalists. And that's pretty much where she's been at the entire time. You've got to give it to her. And then, what does the 1998 treatise say? What does it say? She says refugee status ought to be temporary. You've got to subject these folks to, revision from time to time. She says citizenship. People should be encouraged in that direction. You've got to subject them, though, to an English language test and a values test. On temporary migration, her position's kind of funny. Like, on the one hand, it's kind of, old school labour protectionism, jobs for locals type of stuff, but then an accommodation to, small business needing to bring in pliable labour because, the whole fish and chip shop aspect. So then when confronted with that, what did John Howard do? What did John Howard do with all of that? John Howard adopted and absorbed all of that. He eliminated Pauline Hanson, Mark I, and then eventually saw her, committed her to 11, including Tony Abbott, a process which saw her in jail for 11 weeks. By ultimately doing preference deals in Queensland as well as absorbing all of her immigration policy base into his own policy. And what are we confronted with now? Which, by the way, going back to the Bendigo story, was the reason out of bitter spite that my dad, at the time a journalist, when they introduced the English language test, held off on getting his citizenship until the day he was old enough that he was exempt. He was like, I'll decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they remain. So, what are we confronted with now? Like more or less John Howard's, roadmap for our immigration system with polite tweaks here and there and with different language used. So, my colleagues and I are about to prepare for the horrible anniversary every single year of the reopening of offshore processing in Nauru and Manus Island. Only Nauru remains. So we mark now the 13th year, the unlucky 13th year of those centres being reopened. Citizenship, of course, remains subject to a values test. There's a question about Alan Border, I swear to God. My father's, he didn't have to sit it, but he looked through the booklet. There's a question about Alan Border on there. There's a question about Banksias on there. It has to be administered in English. It has to be. Then on temporary migration, we continue to have this fundamentally extractive, exploitative user pays scheme that is designed with the interests of employers in mind, and ironically for which workers themselves continuously get blamed when they accept conditions that are less than the conditions that exist in the general economy. And there's a view of history, I suppose, looking back on all of this, that says from the 1980s and the 90s onwards, during the neoliberal era, as governments began to restrict social spending, they increasingly tried to derive their legitimacy from strongman sort of tactics by positing themselves as protectors of the citizenry, essentially, through increased policing, through increased jailing, and through sort of punitive border policies, and that these two processes are sort of in a deathly lockstep, the contraction of public services and the ratcheting up of policing and immigration controls, and that's the ever-present logic that the far right fixes upon, correctly identifies and grossly amplifies. Just to wrap up my extremely overlong answer, I think that most recently that sort of feedback loop between the logic of the present, the existence of the far right, the responses of government was really apparent when it came to the ending of indefinite immigration detention in 2023. So I'm sure folks in the audience are aware the High Court at that time ruled that a 2-decade-long policy of indefinitely detaining people, that is, keeping them locked up because they didn't have a visa for the rest of their lives, came to an end. Around 360 people were released from the community, into the community, and because some of those folks had previously done time in jail, they were not being released from jail, they were being released from detention because they didn't have a visa. There was this unbelievable, unpredictable even to us, feeding frenzy that involved these YouTubers sort of atting us and tagging us at the HRLC. We had some involvement in the case, and calling for vigilante violence for people to take up arms and defend themselves against these criminals who had been released into the streets. And then you had, Channel 9 setting up media encampments in front of the hotels where God knows how they'd identified, presumably through leaks, people were being housed. And then you had, within days, the government and Peter Dutton co-designing the most unbelievably draconian set of restrictions on people who were released into the community with, 20-plus conditions that they were subject to, lifted directly from the high-risk terrorism offenders, supervision regime, and subjecting them to mandatory 12-month minimum sentences as a consequence of breach. And that was all being done, that ecosystem all just clicked in. So I think examining, and then, earlier this year when I went just as a sociological exercise to the, March for Australia rallies, and I got out at Flinders Street Station, remigration of criminal immigrants was, something that was a real trope that ran through all of that. So where then the space within which all of this is taking place is where sort of discourse is at within the far right sort of online Reddit sphere, and where government policy is at and where public mobilising is at and the public sentiment is at, there's barely any distinction between it. So I think we have to answer for all of these social processes when we examine the present.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I mean, many of the things that you've all brought up shows that there's this continuum as well, that we're not talking about a single homogenous set of positions and views, but there is a slippery slope. Cam, in your work and in your book, obviously looking at how people go down the rabbit hole, where is the overlap and what is the overlap, I guess, between the risk of people going from a sort of distrust of authority and some scepticism and some healthy questioning to deeper suspicion and then moving from sort of maybe a populist position to more extreme views?
Yeah, so conspiracy theories are a really big part of the far right because a lot of far right rhetoric and ideas fundamentally depends on things that aren't true and conspiracy theories. Blaming people who are not responsible for things. I think the fact that you see a lot of conspiracy theories about race, particularly in Australia, it has this way of turning the people who are the majority, like white people, they go from being, the majority holding all the positions of power, etc., to suddenly the subjects of a terrible crime against them. That's the function that conspiracy theories play, and that's why the far right often uses them. I mean, you see so often that this is a response to the kind of conditions in people's lives, and I think it is a lot, like, part of it is, there is like a kind of, I think also a little bit of like a kind of cultural thing as well. So I don't think it's, if you literally did just fix, all the societal problems, as good as that would be, I recommend that they do that. It wouldn't completely fix it, but it is such a big part of it. There was a story in a book where we spoke to a psychologist who was dealing with a army veteran who was like no longer able to serve anymore because of an injury that he'd served, and he was trying to get compensation from the government from it, and it was going through this long bureaucratic process because of course they want to test all the faking or whatever the justification is for all the paperwork. And as it was happening, his life was getting harder, he was running out of money, he was getting more bitter and bitter. And the psychologist speaking to us said you could see him start to grasp for reasons why this happened. This was a guy who served his country, had done everything he was told to do, and yet felt like he was being abandoned. And then one day something magical happened, which is the government sorted itself out. He got paid out his compensation. And the psychologist saw him immediately turn away from these conspiracy theories that were explaining why the government wasn't doing the thing that it was supposed to do, helping him, someone who was hurt in the process of defending the country. That was a significant change, not because someone had sat him down and been like, well, actually, the thing that you said about the Illuminati isn't quite right. It was because this world that he was told about, his sense of justice, doing the right thing, the story that we're all told he'd felt hadn't gone the way that it had, and he was seeking out these other stories. And I think that is the big thing here. There are a lot of people out there. I mean, we're all the hero of our own stories, and that's one of the great things that conspiracy theories do. They take this very complicated world that we live in and turn you into the good guy, and whoever you don't like or you are blaming for being in the way of you as the bad guy. And I think that kind of simplicity, it comes in part from the fact that, if you don't spend time with people, if you're not part of a community, it's easier to turn people who you don't know into a figurine in your head. So I think, we do see these play a big role in the far right. Again, this is not the only explanation. We see plenty of people who are in great conditions in their life, have plenty of money, whatever, who turn to this stuff. But there's definitely some people who are going down that road because they're looking for answers. They felt like they've been let down by institutions. And I think this is the big thing that I always take away. I'm a member of the media. The media gets criticised all the time. I think some of it is fair, some is not. But I think the most important thing is holding ourselves to the highest standard, because if you're not putting forward something worth trusting in, no wonder people are going to turn to other things. It makes total sense. And that's why, as we think about a society where we both want to be empathetic, we want to understand where people are coming from, understand their problems, we also have to demand so much of the people who choose to put themselves in positions of power, because we are trusting them. They do have to earn their trust, as Oscar said before.
I think a lot of these reflections around kind of what happened when and when did we take this turn. The pandemic's often kind of pulled out as a moment where that trust and the lack of connection. And I mean, is that something that's been borne out through the work you've done?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, you know, we really came to the conspiracy theories, my co-author and I, because we were looking at it for a while, but then we wrote the book because we saw COVID happen. And, you know, like, on its face, it was one of these things. You're like, in a weird way, it kind of sounded like conspiracy theories come true. You are being locked in your house. You do have to do these things. And I think, you know, the flattening on nuance and, you know, people taking advantage of the fact that you can, you know, reduce things and not explain them, that kind of, you know, paved the way for it. You know, like we've never, I think, really done a very good look back at the COVID-19 pandemic, understand the lessons that we learned for a lot of reasons. I mean, I don't like to think too much about it. It was not a great time. But in terms of like big changes that happened to society suddenly, you know, it was something that there were things that were done well and things that are not done so well. I think we haven't learned a lot, and we saw that in terms of building up people who were you know, like who chose not to agree, and as many Australians did follow. Like, I should say, like, Australia, for the most part, citizens were very good at following the rules. We really, really did that. The thing that kind of left over, and this is where it kind of comes into the technology of it all, is that there was this whole group of people who, for whatever reason, didn't want to get vaccinated, didn't want to be locked down, often for many good reasons. I don't want to get a syringe. I don't want to stay in my house. Totally makes sense. And then when all these restrictions went away, it didn't become such a big issue. But they were really tapped into these networks now. You know, they were on the receiving end of, you know, being in Telegram channels, following Facebook's accounts, and all those kinds of things that I think has created this kind of like nervous system that gets reactivated at these times that I think is partly responsible for why we see people increasingly turning to these fringes now on other issues.
So following from the pandemic, we had then the referendum and the failure of the Voice to Parliament constitutional amendment proposal. How much, Tarneen, do you think that was a turning point? Or, you know, there's obviously a long history of racism in this country, but the weaponising and the level of vitriol that has really ramped up during that campaign. What are your reflections as a community organiser as well and campaigner?
Yeah, there was like, I mean, it was pretty violent and scary for lots of First Nations people, as like a queer person as well. Like, similar things happened within the plebiscite. And I guess for me, it was like something that I never wanted to go to a vote anyway, for like other reasons. But like one of the reasons as well is because the people that are in that community are under a level of scrutiny that other community and minority groups aren't. And when I was writing about the referendum, and I was like talking and writing about the comparison of being like a queer person and being Aboriginal, I guess like I just thought, whoa, like here I am as an Aboriginal person who's queer, and I've gone through this vote twice. And at the end of the day, it wasn't a vote about, you know, like obviously it was a vote about whether we should be included in the Constitution in a particular way and have a voice to Parliament, but it really was all of the things around it. And I guess what we also saw was like off the back of COVID, that all of these groups were tied in and were working together and collaborating. And we also, I think I also saw the right organised in a way that in Australia that I haven't seen previously. We in the left are usually really good at tech. We're good at like organising people online and talking to people. And I think that it was one of those moments for me to be like, oh, we've lost this. And it was such a key part of how like people on the left particularly organise communities and talk to people. Because unlike like the rich people, we're not able to buy ads in newspapers. And so when we talk about tech, as you were talking about, Cam, it was a time when like people were able to like access social media and have their voices heard. And we were really winning that race. And we really flooded the airwaves and flooded all the channels. But then like the TikTok rose and the right was getting creative. And I remember, like, I don't know if anyone else is on this side of social media, but like there's the like ASMR videos. You'll be like the slime things, really entertaining, very calming. But then I saw like something pop up like on my TikTok for you page, and it was Jacinta Price and a slime video, like split screen. And I was just like, whoa. And it was just really like, honestly, it was like probably the only time I've really could listen to her, to be fair. But I was just like, nah, we've absolutely fucked it.
So slime videos is part of the part of the strategy. But I mean, you talked about connection before, and that kind of just good old going out and talking to people. Yeah, I mean, are you and the combination with the creativity and how to use the tools that are there? How do we interrupt this? How do we catch up and overtake where the strategizing and the money, of course, is part of the challenge there. But what can we do to tackle that?
I mean, it's really hard now. We're in like this era of where Meta has so much control over what we see and what we don't, and the algorithm is like much stronger than it has ever been before. And big tech has so much control over like what we say and like what we do. So it depends like on how what we see. And so I could say yes, let's get digital, but that's not what I'm saying. We have to beat the algorithm. We have to go out and have real conversations with people, and that's like having kitchen table conversations or handing out at a farmer's market, like catching up with your family and friends and being intentional and talking about what their values are and being curious. And also just like caring about the world, like showing up for each other and showing humanity for each other. Because when you're talking about this veteran, it just makes you think like of the people that don't have others around them to care for them. And they can't imagine the type of care that can be offered. And when people can't imagine that, that's when people also fall into that far right conspiracy theory, because they don't have other people supporting them. So like, how can we get community around each other to stop each other from being so isolated and falling into the online trap as well?
Thank you. Oscar and Sanmati, both of you kind of were referencing really this kind of grievance harvesting phenomenon that we're seeing more and more of as well. And you know, so I'm interested in your thoughts around, how do we actually zero in on what those legitimate grievances are, and that kind of idea of positing solutions that actually tackle the inequalities that give rise to those grievances.
I think something about grievance, especially economic grievance, that is really interesting and I think worth keeping in mind in this conversation is, you know, a lot of us would have heard this very kind of tired analysis about, you know, the white working class is facing economic anxiety and therefore they turn to the far right. I really think that there's a whole missing element there. The same economic conditions, the same grievances can produce a popular, democratic, progressive, collective response. Those same conditions can also produce a disengaged, resignated, defeated response, or they can produce a far-right conservative backlash. And what it depends on is whether people who are experiencing these grievances have access to kind of like an interpretive layer that can explain what is happening, who's benefiting, what are my interests, what is the way out, what is the way forward, what does the future look like. I think that a lot of what we have to do is not only meet the grievances, but also begin providing people strong frameworks for understanding what those grievances are, who is responsible, and what can be done. I think, you know, I think the rise of the far right is this like massive structural shift in our politics. And so the solutions are going to have to be equally massive. I think, you know, it's wonderful being on panels like this where you have people from so many backgrounds because it's going to take all hands on deck, you know. I think where the union movement can be useful is that, you know, Pauline Hanson and One Nation, every few months, every 3 years, they will push out another folk devil to get everyone worked up about. It's like an endless parade of people that they want us to be scared of. You know, trans teachers, or, you know, like gay space lasers. I don't know, whatever. They're very, very creative, imaginative people. And this isn't just bigotry. It has a strategic function, and the strategic function is diversion. One Nation loves to be on this ground of these like folk devils, immigration, culture war. They love it. What they don't love is when the conversation starts turning to, how did you vote about penalty rates? Yeah. How did you vote about parental leave? How did you vote about people's rights at work, about people's access to unemployment benefits or student loan relief? When the conversation moves there, they're not so confident and bold anymore. I think it's really significant that after the National Press Club speech, where Pauline Hanson shamefully attacked women who take paid parental leave, she came out and revised her position. And this is not a politician who is known for contrition, you know? Pauline Hanson is not known for saying something outrageous and coming out and walking it back. But with this issue, she felt like she had to. With this kind of line, she started getting scared. And I think the way the unions can be useful here is, you know, those issues are our bread and butter. That's like what we talk about all the time. So I think when it comes to grievance, you know, as has been pointed out, they masterfully exploit those grievances. But if we can move the attention to, well, what in the moments that count, when the pressure is on, how do you actually act? Then never with working people.
Yeah, I mean, just on the theme still of kind of basic workplace fairness. I mean, Sanmati, can you tell us a bit about how that's playing out in terms of maybe finding some common ground between different and disparate interests, ways that we can try to, you know, come together to push back on some of these things?
Yeah, I reckon that, you know, sort of while I was preparing for this, you know, I think where things have sort of gone wrong for us. But basically, I think while I was reading Pauline Hanson's, you know, maiden speech, I thought to myself, we have fallen into her multiculturalist trap. Like we have, and by we I include very much myself, have fallen into a trap of, you know, sort of positing the struggle for migrant refugee rights as sort of a cultural or a spiritual run, rather than one that has a hard economic background and takes and is connected to the same economic conditions that everybody face. We haven't taken our struggle and said the border policing that we are subject to is part of a distraction from the same social forces that are cutting your welfare, that are disinvesting in your universities. We have millions of international students coming in to work for half the minimum hourly rate because John Howard has ripped away funding from Australian universities. These are two sides of the same coin. Now we're better off together. We haven't taken our struggle there. Instead, and so to come to your, rather than moaning on myself, and, you know, whatever, but I think that the only way forward, there's nothing for it but for a coalitional politics going forward. Because it is absolutely plain that from the migrant and refugee rights movement's point of view, a politics that is based on not shared interests but shared tastes or sensibilities, or a politics that is based on, you know, compassion and common humanity and things that are sort of abstractions, but not hard things that we have in common, won't survive. Not least because, you know, going up to, you know, a veteran who's halfway through, you know, some tribunal process to determine, you know, the basis for their livelihood, and, you know, beseeching them for compassion for people arriving by boat is not going to land well. Folks don't have that to give. And in any event, compassion comes from a place of largesse. It's conditionality that still reposes in somebody who's able to, you know, exercise it adversely. Anyway, to come to a positive story, look, I think, you know, since... If I say the 7-Eleven wages scandal, I can't even see people in the background. Let's assume that people are nodding. But, you know, more than a decade ago, there was an enormous scandal that was identified whereby 7-Eleven franchises were just systematically ripping off workers, so in a range of different ways, but it was like they had a, you know, WhatsApp chat group or something. So all of these franchise owners were basically doing the same thing. They were bringing in international students. Back in those days, visa cancellation based on breaching your work limit was mandatory. It had to happen. So it was like this guillotine that existed on top of students. And employers were well aware of that. So they were making students work an hour in excess of their student visa conditions and paying them half the minimum hourly rate. And then when students compared notes and went to their employers, they were like, whoa, but I see you've worked 25 hours, so peace, no money for you. So Alan Fells, God love him, presided over an inquiry into these arrangements, and I was organising with some of those workers who gave evidence at the time, and worker after worker after worker after worker said, we know what the minimum hourly rate is. We know what it is. It's not because we don't speak English. It's not because we can't go on the Fair Work Commission site. We cannot enforce it because of the migration settings. What divides worker from worker, what makes our conditions different from workers who are Australian citizens, are our migration settings. Anyway, so fast forward to 2024, our comrades and friends in the union movement, and I think it's probably fair to say that the union movement, and which I'm a part of, has had a checkered history with immigration, let's say. However, came together to just, like shore to shore, endorse the proposition that we need to have a guarantee against visa cancellation for migrant workers who have breached their conditions but they're being exploited at work, and we need a visa to secure people's status so that workers don't get shipped out of the country. That is a bare minimum. Now, we all then were part of a co-design process in Canberra where the Department of Home Affairs, after more than 10 years of a coalition government, had to sit in the room with a bunch of unionists to co-design those protections. And I have to say, that's one of the highlights of my life. Watching the department try and press integrity concerns on people who were vigorously in defence of, workers, and all workers are exactly the same workers, was just such a beautiful, beautiful thing to experience. But that's, I think, what Oscar was talking about. It's when we're, grievance used to be our bag. Grievance and identifying its proper source and telling people what they can do about it effectively and collectively used to be our vibe. How has that been stolen from us? We need to be able to take it back, because that's the powerful thing. When a grievance finds its source, and when there's collective consciousness around that, there's nothing as transformative as that. And I just feel like, there's real spirit in that room in Canberra that carried out those co-design negotiations. Somebody should, put that in the National Archives, because that was a horrible time for the Department of Home Affairs. And the result is that we have these protections that we're now in the process of defending and expanding so they cover all workers. But yeah, that's something that over the great punitive march of our migration laws over 30 years, that was something that was won when people collectively drew a line.
So, okay, in our list of potential antidotes, I think we've now got connection, we've got community, we've got creativity and coalitions smartly being used as well. One of the things that I think has been observed of late in sort of the demographics and the shifts that we're seeing politically is really different divides starting to emerge than kind of the right-left distinctions that we're kind of used to based on economic classifications, but differences around age, around gender, around geography. We also know that the demographics are definitely trending towards more rejection of some of these politics, in younger generations. As probably the oldest person on this panel, is this the last gasp of a generation trying to push back? How much of the hope can we assume? There's obviously analysis also saying that there's really different divides taking place between younger men versus younger women and gender diverse folks, for example. So, are there things there that we can draw on? And maybe that's coming back to the creativity and the slime videos.
They pay us a lot to say nothing. I can't remember your question.
Is the younger generation going to give us the hope, I guess, for how we navigate out of the situation that we've got into at the moment?
I think we just have to. It's just. But I think as well, we're in the world, and people like across gender and class. Like there's a divide there, of course. Like I thought millennials were like all that, 10 years ago. But we've been taken over, and that's great because Gen Z are just like so funny and great. And but like young people are going to inherit a world, like even after alpha and blah blah blah, and going to inherit a world that's like really, really flawed, and like there's going to be so much destruction in the world, whether it's like climate catastrophes, and it's going to require people to organise and like find community in a different way that I probably never would have imagined, and like many people in this room would have never imagined as well.
I think when it comes to, our young people, is this the last gasp of like a dying generation, dying way of thinking? I think the far right and its like core narratives, like anyone can fall for this, and anyone can be liberated from this thinking too. In the Anglosphere, in the English-speaking world, there's this interesting thing where young people are like totally, at the moment, like repelled from the far right. In like Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, that's kind of a strong trend. But if you go to continental Europe, if you go to Germany or France, there's a like really strong far right currents that happen amongst young people there. So I'm always a little, I don't think young people are uniquely immune. I think these things can reach anywhere, but I'm 25, and a lot of my friends, like, they give me hope all the time, the people I'm around, and, in the union movement and just in my life. But yeah, I think when it comes to generations, I think anyone can fall for this, but yeah, anyone can also be shown an alternative.
And that idea that anyone can fall for this, I think, is something that comes out, Cam, in your work as well, that it's also a bit, we often are lumping in a whole lot of things together, from extreme, really dangerous extremists to people who may have, whatever legitimate grievances or, gullibility or just a desire for a nice simple answer for things, which, would be really convenient. So, that idea of not demonising the people who might have been persuaded and not giving up to bring them back. I mean, are there things that you've seen in the research that you've done around bringing people back?
Yeah, I wish I had a really simple answer. But, I think in a way there is an answer that we kind of know. It's just a tough one, which is the very often it's a kind of giving people a pathway to come back from something. People aren't defined by their worst moments. We should also hold people accountable as well. I think there's, that's not to say you can just do whatever and get away with it. But, in particular, you see with white nationalist groups, far right, really far right groups, targeting young people, particularly young men, like they are, as you mentioned, I think in the start, Asia is looking at young men, and when I say young men, I mean like men who are in their teens, whose brains are not fully formed, who are being preyed upon by people who know that they can bring them in. So, the reason that they like doing that is because they are kind of easier to mould, and it's easier to bring them so far in that it's hard to go back out of. And the thing that I always kind of come back to is I kind of think most people need to convince themselves that they need to change their mind. I don't think that you change someone's mind, you give them the leeway. And so you hear, a lot of the time from people who do manage to have family or friends come out of it, the answer is giving people grace, but also setting boundaries. And I think that that's like, for example, being like, if you're going to spout off about X, Y, Z, I don't accept that. I have rules in my house. I'm not going to talk to you about that. But, I'll talk to you about the footy or whatever. And I think that gives people a chance to recognise their humanity, see people as more than just their beliefs on one topic that maybe they haven't thought that much about. Maybe they just kind of got into for whatever reason, and give them a chance to see that there is a better solution. Because I guess fundamentally I always think that the far right stuff depends on lies, conspiracy theories. Now with the AI stuff, I think they're really into that because it allows you to create this fantasy world. I think that, there is a kind of, if we can bring people back to reality and give them an excuse to come back to reality, that's the most powerful thing. And that's the thing that we need to do at an individual level, but at a societal level as well. Give people a reason not to clasp to, mistaken ideas about who to blame for things by solving those problems as well. It's, I think it's tough, and when we speak to people who deal with this, we say, don't put yourself in harm's way. You don't, when people do the wrong thing, they should be held accountable. But we have to accept that, particularly if you're trying to get people to change their minds, it means, giving them some space to do it and trusting and having the faith that people will do it. People don't want to believe the wrong things. I don't think people don't want to hate people. You've just got to give them the space not to.
Well, to come back to reality, we're now actually going to go to the audience and hear some other questions. So I think the lights will come up and there will be a couple of mics around. So we've got about 15 minutes for some questions for any of the panellists. If you would like to put your hand up and a mic will come to you. There's one here in the front, a couple at the front. Oh, sorry, one person already's got a microphone. Great.
Tina, standing up. I thought everything you guys said was super fascinating. I'm probably not going to articulate this exactly as I thought of it in my head, so excuse my funny ramblings. But I just wanted to, I work in climate in very progressive spaces, and I wanted to just open the discussion around the fact that progressive circles in the left, as much as we can say they're, the right's doing this, the right's doing that, they're doing terrible things, we're responsible in the left, in progressive circles. We put up a lot of entry fees for people to come into our circles. We keep our tent very, very small. And I just wanted to kind of touch on that and see what you on the panel thought about that, and how much we should also be kind of uncomfortably dealing with accountability of how much we've also let this happen. Thanks.
I mean, I will be the first person to say, the left, we have a lot to answer for, as particularly being a black fella in the left, organising in the left, just been let down over and over and over again by different movements. But also recognising that, in 2016, in this era, we were so, we'd cancel people so easily, and we were so quick to do it. And I mean, I think we've slowed down a bit, but we were relentless, I will say. Any queer people in the audience that remembers Queer Meme Group in 2017? 2 people? Great. But it was we cancel each other and who wants to come to a movement like that? Who wants to come to a movement that's so quick to cancel and cut people off at the knees as soon as they make a mistake? And I think we need to be better at welcoming people and bringing people in. Our older people within the movement have brought me in and when I've made mistakes. So how can we be that to others? And I think we need to continue to do that and learn from people that have come before us.
Can I give it a crack? I was in a conference, a much maligned Queensland conference last year, and I think it was Sam Watson who said that the right is out here looking for recruits and the left is out here looking for people who have betrayed the cause and betrayed the movement. The right will go out and find people where they're at and take them on a godforsaken journey to becoming Pete Evans. And we take people who have a hair of a difference between us and then we put them in hellish purgatory and kick them off a WhatsApp group. And I think there's something about that, but not to be too cloying about it, but can I read a banger of a quote from Oscar's report that I read? Will that kill you?
No, go ahead.
All right. So Oscar says it's not that workers oppose social justice politics, but that social justice movements gained salience at the very same time that distributive questions were de-emphasised. And I think that that's part of what we have to answer for, that our movements haven't linked themselves to the material basis of people's lives. We haven't expressed ourselves as being concerned with distributive questions. And so, of course, painting us as the elite, I mean, you know, it hangs true in a terrible sort of way, and then all of a sudden you find yourself at the centre of a conspiracy theory. Like, there is something that we have to answer for, and a pivot that I think needs to happen in some of our politics, because the left used to be the only force with a credible answer for material questions, and, you know, now it's, in fact, avoiding them. So, yeah, I think you raise a good point.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, Oscar.
Really, really quickly, like super quickly. I think that if your solidarity isn't like uncomfortable sometimes, then your tent is way too small. Like, movement building like should challenge you sometimes, and I agree with everything that's been said.
Thanks.
Hello.
Okay, any other questions?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you, everyone, for everything you've said. I think one of you said that someone was going down the rabbit hole, and then when this issue was solved, they came back to reality. So my question is, it feels like the far right especially promises things that they know they'll never be able to deliver, but they don't care about the consequences. And I'm not suggesting that the left should promise things they can't deliver, but how do you balance or care or care about the consequences and still counter that?
Without over-promising.
Maybe I'll just jump in and take a quick stab at it and just say that, I mean, I think you see the far right really hone in so accurately on the grievances, because very often there's no need for them. They're not actually solving it, so they don't feel uncomfortable about identifying it. I'm just a journalist, but sometimes I see, you know, politicians from outside of the far right who are clearly part of mainstream, who want to do things but have to not necessarily just talk about the biggest pressing issues because they're part of a party or they've committed to stuff that isn't necessarily directly solving that. So I think, you know, always keeping the, like, you know, your guiding star on what is the things that are really that's affecting people, and explaining yourself. And yes, like in a democracy, there are compromises. You can't do exactly what you want to do, but giving audiences and public the benefit of the doubt to explain that and understand that, but really, really making not sure that you're going to try and see if you can brush it under the rug because you don't have a good answer. Because I find that the most fertile space for conspiracy theories for the far right is where there are uncomfortable truths or lies that are being told by people in power.
Can I have a crack at the answer? I'm just like not really answering every question, but having a go at it. But anyway, can I, does anyone follow Gary Stevenson? Gary Stevenson's work? So Gary Stevenson said in this reel that I was watching the other day that his brother had said to him that sort of far-right populism is not so much a political movement but an aesthetic movement. And I think that it's true to say, which is part of the, like, just say stuff, like just be Piers Morgan and be like, I'm silenced, I've been silenced. Like, I'm talking on TV to you about being silenced. And like, I think that part of our difficulty is that we, you know, as folks who want to see a different world, don't like think that facts are an answer to aesthetics, and don't, there's no pathos, there's no, you know, whatever, like we don't seek to mobilise affect. And I'm not saying that I don't endorse the strain of thought that says the only answer to disinformation is different disinformation. But what I mean to say is that, like, we're not necessarily going to win arguments with folks through simply fact-checking them and playing into the frame. We need to speak to people in different language and not our language, and, like, maybe get a bit razzle-dazzle about things. I mean, I'm not that person, but maybe you are, I don't know. But, like, if anyone's that person, I think now is a good time to, like, just set up, you know, a podcast or something.
I think it's worth, like, keeping in mind that what the far right offers people at its core is participation in this epic, mythic struggle, this idea that, you know, you are actually biologically the best kind of human being. You know, it's like this insane offer, like it's a spiritual, like an ego psychic offer that is like really hard to resist. And it's not a policy program. It's not like, vote for us and we will change funding to this department and remove like these like that might be what it sounds like on the TV, but what's really being sold is enlistment into a collective destiny. So we need to offer a collective destiny of our own, like a universal one. We, I think, need to have the courage to have our own like reconstructive vision for society. Like, it's so untenable, the direction that we're all heading in. And we are the forces that have actually transformed society. Well, you know, they've never done it, we've done it. I just think that, yeah, once you can sort of see what's really being offered here, like, you know, we have to speak on that level of identity formation and civilization building as well.
So we have to sell a future as well, a better future than is being offered on the other side. Okay, next.
Hello, please forgive me because I still haven't quite figured out how to phrase this question, but it's for you, Oscar, and to an extent Sanmati, because you both sort of have talked about working in the union movement. I'm a unionist too, and also a law student. And I love that you both talked about unions as a sort of like space to be able to like push back, but I think that we need to reckon with the fact that there is an ideological fracture within the movement, and there are powerful and well-funded unions who have been behind a lot of sort of like conservative push. For example, like in South Australia, the MPs who voted for the abortion ban were backed by one of those unions. So I suppose my question is, as workers, as unionists, as leftists, is there still scope to use what should be this massive and powerful force when it is so fractured and when there is risk that there are people who are sort of being chucked away, thrown to the dust, like in the scope of that? I guess, how do we reckon with that? What do we do? How do we fix it?
Do you want to go first?
I think that there is, when I talk about unionism, I suppose I'm saying collectivism. I suppose I'm saying the collective activity of workers in their unison, you know. I'm not so much talking about union bureaucracies that are subject to exactly the type of market forces that you are talking about and that have, you know, mediated certain types of conflict in, you know, the interests of bosses historically and, you know, things like this. What I think is that even union bureaucracies, however powerful they are not immune to the forces from below, that is the will of their own workers, and that if we have a difficulty with what our union bosses are doing, we need to collectivise and we need to get rid of them. Or we need to change the position that our unions take, and that is what's so important about unions, that they're nothing other than, or they can be nothing other than an expression of the will of their membership. And I suppose to that end, there's a whole bunch of things that are happening in Victoria. I think the teachers have been on strike today again, another example of what can happen when there is, you know, push and pull within different forces within unions. So I think conflating union bureaucracy with what unionism can be and what workers collectively can be is probably not the right way to approach the question necessarily, and maybe not a cause for as much despair, especially with what we're seeing with rank and file organising recently.
Thank you. We are sadly out of time for more questions, but I do want to just check in with the rest of the panellists as well to see, I mean, I think actually quite a lot of hope has actually come out through the course of our conversation already, but is there anything in particular that we haven't covered that gives you hope at a time when sometimes it can feel overwhelming, and what is that kind of future ideal that we need to be selling, that will inspire and counteract the forces that we're seeing?
I mean, for me, I just draw so much hope from history, honestly. Like, we have, like, workers, progressives, people in marginalised groups, we have beaten, like, enemies far worse than Pauline Hanson. Like, we have survived some real, you know, and I take a lot of inspiration from past struggles and just, like, the courage there. And I think that when I'm feeling down, I think about, like, the, you know, the barriers they faced and how they overcome it.
Yeah, that historical perspective. Tarneen?
Yeah, now I think about it is like definitely historical. Like we did a leaflet about like treaty and the history of that, and we're looking at like the first calls for it in like the 60s. And we're in Victoria, we have a treaty now, which is massive, and that gives me hope for the future, that they are like envisioning like what the next 50 to 100 years looks like, and what the hopes are. So to have the opportunity to like be witness in this moment, to be alive and living, to see what that looks like in the next year, I feel really lucky and hopeful for the future.
Cam?
I think I feel that, I mean, like the more attention that these movements get, the more they kind of get punctured by it. And I think part of their rise has been as a result of structural reasons, like, you know, changes in major political parties in Australia. And my kind of hope, and I do believe that this will happen, is, you know, like, people will see that, when they take it seriously, they'll move away from it. Because I really don't think that most people believe in a far-right ideology ultimately. I think they're looking for answers, and I believe that other people out there who have real answers will find a way to fill that gap. And I don't think it's been done successfully at the moment, but there's plenty of time. And I think that, I mean, that's the kind of always arcs towards the truth. You know, there's always reality checks.
Thanks. Sanmati?
Can I answer your question by way of a story? So
very quickly.
So earlier, I think it was earlier this year, Pauline Hanson tried to screen her like absolutely cursed, godforsaken film at Village Cinemas at Crown Casino. A bunch of union members, like teenagers, babies, sweet angels, like a bunch of queer kids, a bunch of dorky little Indian kids, like sweet, blessed angels of the future, all of them union members, came together and they decided to have, you know, a kind of wildcat action and to walk off with absolutely zero protection whatsoever. And their union, coming back to the, you know, whatever, their union was like, do not do that. We're in the middle of these EBA negotiations. It's problematic for you to do this. Anyway, long story short, it was all smoothed over. They walked off the job and they painted during their little break, they painted these placards on the back of, you know, like cornetto boxes that were sort of like, you know, touch one, touch all, like Pauline hates us but wants to be served by us. And the result of their action was that their bosses had to come in, all of them, you know, white men from the South Bank office, to serve Pauline Hanson and her people their drinks. And they all, you know, stood out the front, and they were sort of like, well, what Pauline Hanson and her vision represents, and this vision of the world represents, is an equal and indistinguishable attack against all of us. It's not just that she's racist, it's not just that she's queerphobic, it's not just that she's against women, it's that she's against workers, and this is who we are, and this is us in our collectivity. And they, like, were just so beautiful. It was so excellent. And they got, I think they ultimately got WorkSafe in, and it was declared to be a risk to them to have to encounter Pauline and her people. But they're just legends. And I just thought that was so a beautiful and visionary thing to do that was so fundamentally instinctual to them. And they all were connected with each other because they were in union already, and they worked together already, and that's how they knew each other, and that's, I think, how we can win.
Well, thank you for all ending on such a lovely, positive note. Of course, at the Human Rights Law Centre, we think about this all the time around the ideas of our common humanity and what binds us, and the idea of shared commitments and legal protections of basic dignity, equality and fairness for everyone, and that's really what human rights is all about. So a huge thank you to our panellists, to the Wheeler Centre for this collaboration, for all of you joining here tonight, and for those online as well. It's been a great conversation, and hopefully gives people some more conversation starters at the farmers market, at the footy, wherever you may be, to be able to articulate that kind of idea of a shared future that is a far more hopeful and positive one than being posited by those who seek to divide us. I must also, of course, end on a reminder that the Human Rights Law Centre, we are an independent community legal centre doing strategic litigation and public advocacy and policy engagement, and we can only do this work with the support of people like you coming together, coming to these events, signing up to our campaigns, and also donating and supporting us financially as well. So there's some QR codes there up on the screen if you'd like to learn more about our work or support us in any way that you can. It's been a delight to see everyone, and please join me in giving a big warm round of applause for our panellists. Thank you.